If you ever find yourself at a farm auction in western Kansas, and an old man in a seed cap tells you that the best thing he ever bought cost him $75 and almost cost him his marriage, sit down and listen. Because he is about to tell you a story that will change the way you think about every piece of junk you have ever driven past on the side of the road. His name is Roy Caldwell. He is 84 years old now, and he will tell you this story the same way he has told it for the last 40 years, slowly, carefully, like a man laying bricks, one detail at a time, making sure the foundation is solid before he builds the walls. This is that story, and every word of it is worth hearing. It was March of 1971. Richard Nixon was in the White House. Gas cost 36 cents a gallon, and Roy Caldwell was 29 years old, with 120 acres of winter wheat, a pregnant wife named Dorothy, and $312 in the bank. That was everything. That was the whole empire. Roy had inherited the 120 acres from his father, Harold, who had died the previous November. Heart attack in the North Field, same way Harold's own father had gone. The Caldwell men did not retire. They worked until the land decided they were finished, and then they lay down in it. The farm came with the land and the farmhouse and the debts. Harold had owed money to the bank, money to the seed company, money to the equipment dealer. When Roy sat down with the lawyer after the funeral and added it all up, he discovered that his inheritance was worth exactly negative $200. He owed more than he owned, but Roy had something his father never had: stubbornness that bordered on mental illness. At least that is how Dorothy described it, and she was not entirely wrong. Roy needed a tractor. That was the immediate crisis. His father's tractor, a 1958 Ford 861, had thrown a rod in October, and Harold had been borrowing a neighbor's machine when he died. The neighbor wanted his tractor back. Roy could not blame him. But without a tractor, 120 acres of winter wheat was just 120 acres of expensive grass. A new tractor was out of the question. Even a decent used one cost $3,000 or more, money Roy did not have and could not borrow because every bank in Thomas County knew exactly how much the Caldwell farm owed. Roy was a bad risk, and bankers in 1971 were not sentimental about bad risks. So Roy started going to auctions. Every Saturday, sometimes during the week if he heard about an estate sale, he would drive his father's pickup truck to whatever dusty lot or barn was selling off someone else's broken dream. He was looking for something cheap, something he could fix, something everyone else had given up on. He found it on the third Saturday of March at the Holcomb Estate Auction in Ness County. The auction was held on the Holcomb farm itself, a 400-acre spread that had been in the family for 3 generations before the bank finally took it. Equipment was lined up in rows across the barnyard. Tractors, plows, harrows, wagons, all of it tagged and numbered, all of it waiting for someone to give it a new life or a trip to the scrapyard. Roy walked the rows slowly. Everything worth buying was out of his price range. The tractors started at $800 and went up from there. The implements were cheaper but useless without something to pull them. He was about to leave when he saw it. It was parked behind the barn, separated from the main auction items, half hidden by a pile of old fence posts and a rusted water tank. A bulldozer. Or what had once been a bulldozer. A 1949 Caterpillar D4, 22 years old, and looking every day of it. The paint was gone. Not faded, not peeling. Gone. The bare metal was a uniform rust orange, the color of something that had been left outside in Kansas weather for 2 decades and never once been touched by a caring hand. The blade was bent. The tracks were loose. One of the track shoes was missing entirely. The seat was a metal pan with no cushion, cracked and rusted. Something had built a nest in the engine compartment, though whatever it was had long since moved on to better accommodations. The auction tag read, Lot 47, Cat D4, 1949, does not run, sold as is. Someone had written below that in pencil, Good luck. Roy walked around the machine 3 times. He got down on his knees and looked underneath it. He climbed up and looked into the engine compartment. He put his hand on the block and felt the iron, cold and rough and solid beneath the rust. Then he did something that no one else at that auction would have done. He pulled out a wrench, removed the oil drain plug, and caught a few drops of oil on his finger. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger. He smelled it. He held it up to the light. The oil was dark, but not sludge. Someone had drained and refilled the crankcase before parking this machine. That was unusual. People who abandoned equipment did not take the time to change the oil first. This machine had been put away deliberately by someone who thought it might be used again. Roy put the plug back in and went to find the auctioneer. "What can you tell me about the cat?" Roy asked. The auctioneer, a big man named Wendell Cross, looked up from his clipboard. "The D4? Nothing. It is from the Holcomb estate. Been sitting behind that barn since I do not know when. Calvin Holcomb used it for land clearing back in the 50s. After he died, his son never touched it. Now the son is gone too, and the bank wants everything liquidated. Has anyone looked at the engine?" Wendell shrugged. "Nobody has looked at anything about it. It is junk, Roy. Scrap value, maybe $50 for the iron. Save your money." Roy went back to the D4 and stood there thinking. A Caterpillar D4 was a serious machine, not the biggest cat ever made, but tough, reliable, and versatile. In working condition, a 1949 D4 was worth $2,000, maybe more. The engine was a Cat D315, a 4-cylinder diesel that was famous for being nearly indestructible. If the block was not cracked, if the crank was not damaged, Roy was looking at a machine that could be brought back from the dead. The key word was if. The auctioneer got to Lot 47 at about 3 in the afternoon. The crowd had thinned out. Most of the good equipment was gone. The remaining bidders were scrap dealers and bargain hunters, people who bought broken things by the pound. "All right, folks," Wendell called out. "Lot 47, 1949 Caterpillar D4. Sold as is, where is, and I do mean as is. This machine has not run since Eisenhower was president. Do I hear $100? Silence. $75? Roy raised his hand. Wendell looked at him. I have $75 from the young man in the back. Do I hear $80? Silence. $75 going once, going twice, sold. Son, you just bought yourself the most expensive pile of rust in Ness County. Congratulations. A few people laughed. Roy did not. Now, let me tell you about getting the D4 home, because that was an adventure in itself. The machine weighed about 14,000 pounds. It had no working engine, no working tracks, and no way to move under its own power. Roy did not own a trailer big enough to carry it. He did not have money to rent one. What Roy had was a neighbor named Virgil Meeks, who owned a flatbed truck that he used for hauling hay bales. Virgil owed Roy a favor because Roy had helped him pull a calf in a snowstorm the previous January. Roy called in the favor. It took Roy, Virgil, and 2 other neighbors most of a Sunday to get the D4 onto Virgil's flatbed. They used a come-along, wooden ramps, and language that would have gotten them thrown out of church. Dorothy watched from the kitchen window and later told Roy that she had married a fool. Roy did not disagree. The D4 sat in Roy's barn for the next 2 years while he figured out what to do with it. Let me explain that, because it sounds like procrastination. And it was not. Roy worked on the D4 every spare moment he had. But spare moments on a 120-acre wheat farm are rare, especially when you are doing most of the work yourself with borrowed equipment and a stubbornness that your wife has started calling a clinical condition. Roy worked on the tractor in the mornings before dawn. He worked on it in the evenings after the fields were done. He worked on it on Sundays after church, which Dorothy tolerated only because she had decided that the tractor was Roy's form of prayer. The first thing Roy did was tear down the engine. He pulled it out of the machine with a chain hoist his father had welded to the barn rafters 20 years earlier. He stripped it to the bare block, cleaned every part, catalogued everything. The news was better than he had any right to expect. The block was solid. No cracks, no deep corrosion. The crankshaft had surface rust, but no damage to the bearing journals. The cylinder walls were scored, but within tolerance for a rebore. Whoever had changed the oil before parking the machine had done Roy a favor that was worth more than the $75 he had paid. Roy rebored the cylinders using a portable boring bar he built from a surplus electric motor and scrap steel. He ground the valves by hand. He replaced the rings and bearings with parts he mail-ordered from a cat dealer in Wichita who gave him a discount because the parts had been sitting on a shelf for 10 years and nobody else wanted them. The transmission was next, then the hydraulics, then the tracks, every system, torn down, cleaned, repaired, reassembled. Roy kept a notebook of everything he did, every part he replaced, every measurement he took. The notebook eventually filled 200 pages. It was the most detailed record of a D4 rebuild that probably existed anywhere. By the spring of 1973, the Caterpillar D4 ran again for the first time in over 20 years. Roy remembers that morning the way most people remember their wedding day. Clear sky, cool air, the smell of diesel and fresh oil. He turned the key and the big cat diesel turned over, coughed, belched black smoke, and then settled into a steady rumble that shook the barn floor and made the chickens scatter. Dorothy came out of the house and stood in the yard, arms crossed, watching her husband sit on a rusted metal seat with tears running down his face, while a 24-year-old bulldozer rumbled beneath him. She shook her head, but she was smiling. The D4 changed everything. With a working bulldozer, Roy could do things that a tractor could not. He cleared fence rows. He built terraces to prevent erosion. He dug ponds. He leveled ground for new outbuildings. He did contract work for neighbors who needed land cleared or roads graded or stock ponds dug, work that paid cash, cash that Roy used to pay down his father's debts and buy the things the farm needed. By 1975, Roy had paid off every penny his father owed. By 1978, he had expanded his operation to 280 acres. By 1980, he had built a new equipment shed, bought a proper tractor, and put money in the bank for the first time in his adult life. All of it traceable, directly or indirectly, to a $75 pile of rust that nobody else wanted. And the D4 kept running, year after year, season after season. Roy maintained it with the same obsessive care he had used to rebuild it. He knew every sound the engine made, every vibration, every quirk. He knew when the clutch needed adjustment by the way the machine hesitated on a hill. He knew when the oil was getting thin by a subtle change in the exhaust note that nobody else could hear. The neighbors who had laughed at Roy's purchase in 1971 stopped laughing around 1976. By 1980, they were bringing their own equipment to Roy for repairs. He had become the best mechanic in Thomas County, not because he had gone to school for it, but because he had spent 2 years rebuilding a machine that everyone said was beyond saving. And in the process, he had learned things that no school could teach. Vernon Shelby was the man who had laughed the loudest. Vernon ran the farm equipment dealership in Colby. He sold new tractors and combines to farmers who could afford them, and extended credit to farmers who could not. He was a salesman first and a mechanic never, but he had opinions about equipment the way some men have opinions about football, loudly and without much foundation. When Vernon heard that Roy Caldwell had paid $75 for a dead D4 at the Holcomb auction, he told everyone at the coffee shop that the Caldwell boy had finally proven that stupidity was hereditary. The line got a big laugh. Vernon used it for years. Vernon stopped using it in 1982 when his own dealership started struggling. The farm crisis was hitting Kansas hard. Farmers who had bought new equipment on credit were defaulting on their loans. Vernon was stuck with repossessed tractors he could not sell and receivables he could not collect. He needed mechanical work done on the repossessed machines, work that would make them saleable again, and his own shop was too expensive to operate. He drove out to the Caldwell farm on a Tuesday afternoon. Roy was in his shop rebuilding a hydraulic pump for a neighbor's loader. Vernon stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking at the shop that Roy had built from nothing, at the tools that Roy had collected over a decade, at the D4 parked outside, still running, still working, a machine that Vernon had called a $75 piece of stupidity 12 years ago. "I need help," Vernon said. Roy looked up from the hydraulic pump. He did not say anything. "I have got 6 tractors sitting on my lot that need engine work," Vernon continued. "My shop rate is too high to make the repairs profitable. Everyone says you are the best engine man in the county. Will you look at them?" Roy set down his wrench. He studied Vernon for a long moment, the same Vernon who had called him stupid, the same Vernon who had told farmers to buy new instead of fixing old, the same Vernon who had made his fortune convincing people that their perfectly good equipment was obsolete. "Bring them over," Roy said finally. "I will take a look." Vernon started to say something about pricing, but Roy cut him off. "We will figure that out later. Just bring them over." Vernon brought the tractors. Roy fixed them. He charged Vernon half of what the dealership shop would have charged, and the work was better. Vernon sold the tractors at a profit and came back with more. Over the next 3 years, Roy rebuilt 19 engines for Vernon's dealership. It was steady work that kept money coming in during the worst of the farm crisis. But the real story, the part that nobody saw coming, happened in 1987. 16 years after Roy bought the D4, 16 years of daily use and constant maintenance, something went wrong with the engine. It started with a noise, a faint ticking sound, barely audible over the diesel's normal rumble. Roy heard it on a Monday morning while grading a road on the south end of his property. Most people would not have noticed. Roy noticed everything about that engine. He had rebuilt it with his own hands. He knew its voice the way a mother knows her child's cry. He shut the machine down and spent the afternoon checking everything: valves, timing, injectors, bearings. Everything seemed normal. But the ticking persisted when he started the engine again the next morning. Roy decided to do something he had been putting off: a complete teardown. Not because the engine was failing, but because it was 16 years old now, at least in its second life, and 62 years old by the calendar. Some things needed to be inspected, measured, evaluated. It was time. He pulled the engine out of the D4 for the second time in his life and set it on the workbench. He began disassembling it, working carefully, methodically, the way he had done in 1971. Head off, manifolds off, valve covers off, oil pan off. That is when he found the source of the ticking. A hairline crack in the number 3 cylinder wall, thin as a spider's thread, running vertically from the deck surface to the main bearing saddle. The crack was opening and closing with each firing stroke, creating the tick that Roy had heard. The cylinder would need to be sleeved or the block replaced entirely. Roy started measuring, planning, calculating. he would need to pull the crankshaft to properly assess the damage. He unbolted the main bearing caps and lifted the crankshaft out. And that is when he found it. Underneath the number 4 main bearing cap, pressed into a shallow recess that had been machined into the bottom of the cap itself, was a small metal container. It was about the size of a tobacco tin, made of stainless steel, sealed with a rubber gasket that had hardened but still held. Roy sat down on his shop floor and stared at it. In 16 years of working on this engine, he had never fully removed the main bearing caps. He had checked the bearings, adjusted the clearances, replaced the inserts, but he had always done it from above, leaving the caps bolted in place. There had never been a reason to pull them completely. Until now. Roy's hands were shaking as he pried the container open. Inside, wrapped in waxed paper, were 2 things. The first was a roll of cash. Old bills. Nothing newer than 1955. Roy counted it 3 times. For hardly $800. The second was a letter, handwritten on lined paper, folded into quarters. The paper was yellowed, but the ink was still readable. Roy unfolded it carefully and began to read. The letter was dated October 1955. It was written by Calvin Holcomb, the man who had originally owned the D4. To whoever finds this, the letter began. My name is Calvin Holcomb, and I am a farmer in Ness County, Kansas. I am writing this because I am dying, and there are things I need to say that I cannot say out loud. In the spring of 1954, I was hired to clear timber from a property north of Bazin. The owner wanted 40 acres of post oak cleared for pasture. I used my D4 for the job. It took me 3 weeks. On the last day, I was pushing over a dead elm when the roots pulled up a section of ground that had been disturbed before. Underneath the root ball, I found a metal box. Inside the box was $11,000 in cash and a leather pouch containing 4 gold coins. I knew immediately what I had found. In 1933, a bank courier named Samuel Reed disappeared between Bazin and La Crosse with $14,000 in payroll money. They found his truck abandoned on a county road. They never found him or the money. It was the biggest unsolved case in Rush County history. The money I found was the payroll money. I am certain of. The bills were banded with First National Bank of La Crosse wrappers dated February 1933. The gold coins were Liberty Head Eagles, $10 face value each. I should have reported it, I know that. But my wife Ada was sick. The doctors said she needed an operation that would cost $5,000, money I did not have, money the bank would not lend me, money that I could not earn in time. I used $5,000 for Ada's operation. She recovered. I sold the gold coins to a dealer in Wichita for $1,200 and used that money to pay the farm expenses that had piled up while Ada was in the hospital. The remaining $4,800 I could not spend. Every dollar felt like it had blood on it. I hid it in the only place I could think of where nobody would ever look. Inside the engine of my bulldozer, in a compartment I machined into the main bearing cap myself. I changed the oil and sealed the crankcase before I parked the machine. I thought I might need the money someday. I never did. Ada lived another 8 years before the cancer came back. She died in 1963. I have been alone since. I am dying now, too. The doctor says my lungs are finished. I suppose that is what 40 years of Kansas dust will do. I cannot tell my son about the money because he would spend it on drink. I cannot tell the law because the statute of limitations makes it complicated. And I do not want my family's name dragged through shame, so I am leaving it here in the machine for whoever finds it. If that is you, then this money is yours. Consider it payment for being curious enough to look in a place where nobody else bothered. I have one request. The courier, Samuel Reed, had a family, a wife and 2 daughters. They lived in La Crosse. I do not know if they are still there, but if you can find them, give them something. Not all of it. You earned your share by finding it. But give them something, because their father's disappearance was never solved, and they deserve to know that the money he was carrying was found. One more thing. That D4 is a good machine, better than anything they make today. Take care of it, and it will take care of you. That is the only wisdom I have left to offer. Calvin Holcomb, October 1955. Roy read the letter 3 times. Then he sat on his shop floor for a long while, holding $4,800 in old bills and a dead man's confession, thinking about Calvin Holcomb and Ada and a bank courier who disappeared in 1933. Let me tell you what Roy did with what he found, because it tells you everything about the kind of man he is. The first thing he did was nothing. He sat with it for 2 weeks, thinking, praying, talking to Dorothy late at night while the Kansas wind rattled the windows. Dorothy told him to do the right thing. Roy said he was trying to figure out what the right thing was. He started with the family. He drove to La Crosse, 80 miles east, and spent a day at the county courthouse going through old records. Samuel Reed, the missing bank courier, had indeed had a wife and 2 daughters. The wife had died in 1971. One daughter had moved to Colorado. The other, a woman named Martha Reed Patterson, still lived in La Crosse. She was 61 years old. Roy drove to her house on a Saturday morning. He knocked on the door. A woman answered, gray-haired, thin, with eyes that looked like they had spent a lifetime expecting bad news. Mrs. Patterson. Yes, my name is Roy Caldwell. I am a farmer from Thomas County. I found something that I think belonged to your father. He told her the whole story. The D4, the rebuild, the letter, the money. He showed her Calvin Holcomb's confession. He watched her read it, watched her face change from confusion to understanding to something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but somewhere in between. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "So the money was there all along, under a tree in a field." Roy nodded. "Your father was never found, Mrs. Patterson, but the money he was carrying was, at least most of it." Martha Patterson looked at the letter again. This man, Holcomb. He used the money for his wife's operation. Roy nodded again. She was sick. He did not have the money to save her. He found it, and he used it. Martha was quiet for another long moment. Then she said something that Roy has never forgotten. "I spent my whole life hating whoever took that money. I thought someone had robbed my father, maybe harmed him. I imagined terrible things. But this man did not rob anyone. He found money in a field and used it to save his wife's life. I cannot hate a man for that." Roy gave Martha $2,000 of the $4,800. She tried to refuse. Roy insisted. She finally accepted, and they sat on her porch for an hour. 2 strangers connected by a dead man's secret, talking about their fathers and the strange ways that the past reaches into the present. Roy kept the remaining $2,800, but not for himself. He put it into an account at the Thomas County Bank earmarked for young farmers who needed help getting started. Over the next decade, that money, supplemented by Roy's own contributions, helped 6 families make down payments on land or equipment. The D4 got a new cylinder sleeve and was back to work within a month. Roy used it for another 12 years before finally retiring it in 1999. By then, the machine was 50 years old and had been in Roy's possession for 28 of those years. It had cleared hundreds of acres, built dozens of ponds, graded miles of roads, and earned Roy more money than he could calculate. Vernon Shelby heard about the hidden money. Everyone in Thomas County heard about it eventually. Vernon drove out to the Caldwell farm one afternoon, stood in Roy's shop, and looked at the D4 with an expression that mixed wonder with regret. $75, Vernon said. You paid $75 for that machine, and it gave you a career, a reputation, and a hidden fortune. Roy shook his head. It was not the money, Vernon. It was never the money. The money was just paper that someone hid in an engine block. What that machine gave me was a chance to prove that I could build something from nothing, that the thing everybody laughed at was the thing that saved me. He looked at Vernon steadily. You told everyone I was stupid for buying it. You said stupidity was hereditary. I heard about that. Vernon flinched. I was wrong. Yes, you were. But I will tell you something, Vernon. You were wrong about more than just the tractor. You were wrong about what makes things valuable. You spent your whole career telling farmers to buy new, to trade up, to replace anything that was old. You made money doing it. But you also helped put some of those farmers in debt they could not pay. Roy looked at the D4. This machine taught me the opposite lesson. It taught me that old things have value that you cannot see until you take the time to look. That broken things can be fixed if you have the patience. That the thing everyone throws away might be the thing that saves you. Vernon was quiet for a long time. Then he stuck out his hand. Roy shook it. The D4 is in a museum now. The Tri-County Historical Museum in Colby, Kansas. Roy donated it in 2002 with the condition that it be displayed with the full story. The letter from Calvin Holcomb is in a glass case beside the machine, along with Roy's 200-page rebuild notebook and a photograph of Roy at 29 years old, standing next to a pile of rust that nobody wanted. The plaque reads, 1949 Caterpillar D4, purchased for $75 at auction in 1971 by Roy Caldwell, rebuilt by hand, operated for 28 years. Inside this engine, hidden for 32 years, was $4,800 and a letter that solved a 54-year-old mystery. Some things are not junk. They are just waiting for the right person to see their value. Roy Caldwell is 84 years old now. He still lives on the farm. Dorothy is still with him, still calling him a fool when the occasion requires it, which she says is often. Their son, Kevin, runs the operation now, 400 acres, all paid for, no debt. The Caldwell farm that was worth negative $4,200 in 1971 is worth over $1 million today. Roy still goes to auctions sometime. He walks the rows slowly, looking at the machines that nobody wants, the ones with rust and flat tires and auction tags that say, "Does not run." He looks at them the way a man looks at a stray dog in the pound, seeing not what they are, but what they could be. And sometimes, when the price is right and the iron feels solid under the rust, Roy raises his hand. Because Roy Caldwell learned something at the Holcomb Estate auction in 1971 that most people never learn at all. The best treasures are the ones that nobody else recognizes. The best investments are the ones that everybody laughs at. And the best machines are the ones that refuse to quit, even after the whole world has decided they are finished. $75. That is what Roy paid for a piece of junk that everyone said was worthless. And that piece of junk taught him a trade, built his reputation, paid off his father's debts, expanded his farm, and carried a secret worth more than money for 32 years. The engineers laughed. The dealer called it stupidity. And the $75 bulldozer kept working, kept pulling, kept giving, long after the laughter stopped, and the machines that were supposed to replace it were rusting in junkyards of their own. That is the story of Roy Caldwell and his Caterpillar D4, the machine that was too broken to save and too stubborn to die, and the man who saw what nobody else could see, because he took the time to look.